Welcome to the Infinite Women podcast. I'm your host, Allison Tyra, and today I'm joined by Dr. Whitney Dirks, author of Monstrosity, Bodies, and Knowledge in Early Modern England, to tell us about 1600s Englishwoman Mary Herring. So let's start with an introduction to your book, and then you can tell us how she fits into what you're writing about.
So, my book is about what were referred to at the time as monsters or monstrous births. This is physically unusual humans and animals, such as conjoined twins. And I study this topic in England between about 1450 and 1800. These individuals were considered important within the context of the period because they provided evidence about the will of God and or the internal workings of nature, and essentially how people themselves then would interact with that God created natural world. So Mary Herring, in the year 1680, she gives birth to conjoined twin girls. And this event starts a 4.5 year long legal battle over ownership and income. And it comprises the central case study for my book. I talk about this story on and off throughout the entire book. For example, when I'm talking about the Royal Society of London, which was an early scientific society. I can talk about how a local pastor visited the twins when they were a week or so old and then wrote about it to the Royal Society. And so this case study with Mary Herring and the twins really epitomizes my research and is absolutely central to the book. So, Mary Herring was married to Richard Herring. They lived in this tiny village in southwestern Somerset in England. They were very poor. Mary and Richard had apparently been sick for a few years on and off prior to the twins' birth. We know that they had a few children, I think three, when the twins were born. And whereas, so far as I'm concerned, Mary Herring is the real victim in this case. Don't get me wrong, the twins died at about a month old. And so we are talking about neonatal fatality. This is not a happy topic, obviously. But Mary Herring is, I think, the person who suffered the most. And yet we pretty much never get to hear her own voice. So, what happens with the twins is when they're 2 weeks old, one of two things happens. Um, Either Richard Herring, Mary's husband, sells them without his wife's knowledge or consent, in order to gain support for the remainder of the family for as long as the twins lived. Since the Herrings were so incredibly poor, this actually would have been a very substantial, potentially, amount of money coming in order to support both of them and the remainder of their children. Or when the twins were 2 weeks old, they were kidnapped out of an evil get rich quick scheme to put them on show. And the legal case begins after the twins have died, when they were a month old, and it is under Richard Herring's name. He is the person who files the legal documents. The statement that begins the process is his, and he dies within a year. And then Mary Herring, the wife, the mother of the twins, has to re-up the entire legal process in her name because she is a widow, because she was a woman. She was not named other than having given birth. She definitely wasn't the essentially plaintiff, the complainant in the legal case. Um, and so she has to restart the entire process. But even when she does that, the document that becomes her statement is actually just a slightly updated version of Richard's statement. She's about the only person in the entire legal case who never actually gets to speak her own words. And this is particularly interesting in this case because there are a lot of women who are interviewed as witnesses on both sides of the case. And they all get to tell their stories, and a few of them repeat things that they assert Mary said at some point. But we literally never get Mary's own story in her own words.
Now, I like that you bring up her own story in her own words because one of the things that does come up a fair bit is the documentation side of women's history and how difficult it can be to even find that documentation in the first place, but then also what are the biases that different people are bringing to their version of someone's story.
I'm the first historian, I'm the first scholar to have looked at this legal case since it occurred. This was working its way through the courts from 1680 through partway through 1684. And I found out about the case because I was studying conjoined twins and other physically unusual humans and animals. And the scholars have known a small amount about Priscilla and Aquila Herring, the conjoined twins, because there are a few surviving sources outside of the legal documents. This includes three different pieces of cheap print, so pamphlet, ballad, that sort of thing, that were printed in London. One of them has a woodcut at the top of it that's ostensibly picturing the twins, but they are, I am really pretty certain, depicted wrong. And so I think the woodcut was created by someone who hadn't actually seen them in person. And the other source that people have known about these twins, there are a trio of decorative ceramic plates that feature them. And this is weird on so many levels. I have not found another instance of what were referred to as monstrous births, depicted in ceramics anywhere in Europe. I The three surviving plates, one of them is different from the other two. The first one is a folk art appearing piece. It's red clay and it's inscribed. So someone took a stylus to it and inscribed some, I think they are initials, and the date 1680 superimposed on the conjoined bodies of the twins. Um, I suspect, I cannot prove this, but I think it was a marriage plate. In the period, these would have the initials of the people who had gotten married, the date that they got married, and while that seems like conjoined twins, a weird sort of motif to put on a commemorative plate, I suspect that it was the most memorable thing that happened in Somerset in 1680. So that plate is depicting the twins kind of on their own. The other two plates, which again scholars have known about for a while, depict their kind of Delftware, blue and white. The colors vary, the motif varies a little bit. They were, I think, produced at least by different people, if not by different potteries. But they depict two gentlemen wearing fancy 17th century gentlemanly clothing, holding up their hands, and they have the conjoined twins balancing on the hands. And around the outside of the plates is variations on the phrase, two persons that are reconciled to rob the parents and to keep the child in 1680. Here is gain o' the broom. And this needs obviously a lot of unpacking. So these plates, I think, scholars think that they were produced in Brislington, which is outside of Bristol, which is in Somerset. And they're referring to the legal case itself, the case that I was able to locate and utilize to tell Mary Herring's story. The plates assert that these two gentlemen, they're county gentlemen in Somerset, I'll come back to them in a little bit, reconciled to rob the parents and keep the child. This is a reference to the children potentially having been kidnapped at 2 weeks of age and put on display for money. The phrase here is Gano. The broom is probably a reference to the Broom or Brome family who were associated with one of those county squires. And so it is essentially, these plates are a political critique of these two county squires, these two gentlemen in the county of Somerset. I was coming at this research from the direction of there are these plates. I know they exist. I was doing some research on them, and I came across a 19th century antiquarian who wrote into his local county journal. This was essentially your local history, white men writing for other white men. And 19th century antiquarians are kind of known within history as having published all sorts of really useful and also really boring information. And in this case, however, the guy writing into this journal says, ah, there was just a plate put on auction that was sold for its weight in silver. And it's one of these plates describing the two persons that are reconciled to rob the parents and keep the child. And he says, and I am writing in to you about the plate that just went up for auction because I too own a plate that depicts these conjoined twins. And he's talking about the inscribed redware one. So essentially, he was writing in to brag about how great his own possession was. But this is useful to me because he also says, ah, yes, and the plate was referring to a legal case in which Henry Walrond, who is one of the squires, was prosecuted for having taken the twins. And that's most of what he says about it. But the fact that there was a legal case made me go, hey, could I find the legal case? It's one of those rabbit holes that historians love to jump down. Very luckily, this was a legal case that was pursued in the Court of Chancery, which was an equity court in London. And an equity court was based around fair judgments. So when people could not get a fair judgment under standard law, common law or church law, they might go to an equity court. And in the case of the Herrings, they went to the equity court in London because Henry Walrond, the guy who took the twins, was their local landlord, who was also the justice of the peace. which means that he was in charge of running the legal system. He was essentially a judge in Somerset. And so, since he was the guy who was being sued, it would have been really unfair for them to try to pursue a judgment against literally the judge in Somerset. And so, luckily, from my perspective, this went to Chancery. The Chancery records are all in English, which is great because I definitely do not read legal Latin or any Latin, really. Um, and it also meant that the catalog had been digitized. And so I was able to locate and then get high quality images of all of the documents in the case, which turned out to be several dozen parchment pieces, which was way more than I ever expected it to be. And it turned into this absolutely massive amount of information that I had no idea I was going to luck into. And as far as historians are concerned, being the first person to study a thing is like a gold star. That is the most exciting thing you can possibly publish about, is something that nobody else knows about. And so the story of Mary and Richard Herring and the twins Aquila and Priscilla, and the county squires, Henry Walrond and Sir Edward Phelps, this became an absolutely central aspect of my research, a central aspect of my book. And it is still the thing that I love to talk about at absolutely any opportunity.
Do we know how the twins died? Like, I don't know if you have a personal preference on which version is true, whether he stole the twins or whether the dad sold them. I mean, the fact that they're even willing to sue their landlord in the first place is a pretty bold move, particularly for the 1600s. So I feel like there's a lot going on here apart from the fact that these girls were conjoined twins. Like this feels like there was a lot happening.
Yes, absolutely. Um, so the twins themselves, they died at a month old. I don't think it was neglect, but having been taken from their mother and cared for by a series of wet nurses, and having been shown publicly for most of the time they were alive, which probably meant that they were being covered and uncovered. And this was May of 1680, but May in England is kind of cold and damp. And so certainly Walrond, the guy who was predominantly holding on to the twins, certainly he attempted to give them medical care. He hired a number of different physicians, an apothecary, both of the wet nurses to care for them. But eventually the twins died. The fact that they did live for a month means that they probably had actually really well conformed internal organs. They were almost fully duplicated through their bodies, connected through the torso, but with four arms, four legs, two heads, two uh, probably generally two chest cavities, that sort of thing. The fact that they lived for a month means that their hearts and lungs were probably well developed. Walren definitely had a financial impetus for keeping them alive as well, because he was putting them on show for money. It was definitely in his own best interests to give them good medical care. I certainly we can still say that him having taken them away from the parents probably contributed to the death, almost certainly did, but I don't think that it was a neglectful death per se. In terms of what really happened, this is one of those questions that historians love to say it's complicated too, right? That is between that and it began earlier than you think it did. Those are some of my go-to phrases when I'm teaching history classes. After having worked through this case, this was originally part of my dissertation. I worked on this case for a dozen years-ish, and before my book came out. And so I have spent a lot of time thinking about what really happened and what is most plausible. The simpler explanation, I think, is that Richard Herring sold the twins. However, I don't think that's what happened. I think it was the evil get rich quick scheme. That said, another historian reading the identical documents could probably argue the other side of things, and I'm not sure I would entirely disagree with them. Part of what's hard to figure out about this case, I mean, there's just so many moving parts. One of them is that the witness statements were not taken until 2 years after the events took place. And so witnesses who claim to remember everything super clearly disagreed over how many other children the Herrings had. So and then there are people on either side of the case. All of Walren's cronies, this included the Brome family, who is mentioned on those plates. All of Walren's cronies, they say some of the same things, which either implies that they all are telling the truth or that they all got their stories straight ahead of time, or that they are all repeating phrases that were asked in the set of questions that they were answering for the case. And since all of the records are being written down by clerks working for the Court of Chancery, this means that everything, even what seems to be direct quotations, are mediated through several different steps. And this is true for all of the people who are interviewed as witnesses. This is part of why we don't have something that I consider Mary Herring's own voice as told by her. Strict minimum, if she were speaking a statement, it would have been mediated through the clerk. But also, her statement was actually her husband's statement. The women uh, who are being interviewed as part of the case, one of whom is named Aquila Taylor. She is Richard Herring's sister. I suspect, I mean, almost certainly, the conjoined twin Aquila was named after her aunt Aquila. It makes me wonder if the aunt had once had a twin sister named Priscilla. Aquila Taylor, so Taylor is her married name. She is interviewed for the case, and she is one of the people who repeats things that she says Mary Herring said. One of them is when Mary Herring is in the house and the twins are taken from her. She says something along the lines of, "Do not tear my children asunder." They're being torn out of her arms. There are a few other things that Mary is supposed to have said, such as that if her husband Richard had actually signed an agreement with Henry Walrond selling the twins, if Richard had done that, then that was on him. She would not sell her twins, and she said if worst came to worst, she would put them on her back and carry them door to door to beg rather than give them up. And so we have these few really poignant reports of what Mary said, but what I actually know about her is almost all inferential, based on her circumstances. I know that she had been sick for several years before the twins were born, which is part of why she and her husband were in such horrible debt. I know that the twins were not her first pregnancy because she had, I think, three children already. This is relevant because, as I mentioned before, the twins are completely duplicated in their bodies, conjoined through the torso. Mary Herring lived through the birth. This was a vaginal birth that she lived through. And she lived for at least 4.5 years past the birth, because that's for how long the case remains in the legal record. I know that when Richard Herring died, less than a year into the whole process, the list of the objects that he owned at his death was worth less than £5 sterling. That was enough that Mary was considered a pauper, and so she was allowed to continue the case in her own name in forma pauperis, which essentially meant the court would waive all of her legal fees because she wouldn't be able to pay them. And this is interesting about both Mary and Richard Herring because if Richard was not worth £5 sterling when he died, Richard was a day laborer, an agricultural laborer. He was, this is among the poorest of the professions in England at the time. He might have made something like £15 sterling a year. And so £5 of that, a third of a year's salary. Mary doesn't have that money. Richard doesn't have that money when he dies. This is really interesting because before the twins were taken out of the home, the Herrings had also been putting the twins on display. And it seems like this may not have originally been their idea. It kind of sounds like local people just started showing up and then telling their friends, and then more people showed up. And according to various witnesses in the case, hundreds of people a day were lining up outside of the Herring's home. This is a small cottage, two underrooms and some attic garret space. And the lines stretched out of the house for hours. People would wait in line. And everyone who came in would leave a small amount of money for the Herrings, on the order of about sixpence. And so the amount of money that was being left for them wasn't a lot. However, if you have hundreds of people every day leaving sixpence apiece, they were making perhaps £5 sterling a day. They might have been making up to, according to one of the estimates, £17 sterling a day, more than an annual salary for Richard. And so if they are getting so much money being donated to them by the people who come to see the twins, and yet when Richard dies less than a year later, they are still again impoverished, this suggests some really interesting things about their household. One is that even if the twins were a short-term windfall, they definitely weren't a long-term one. Another is that by the time Richard died, Mary is once again destitute. She's a widow with perhaps three other children. She is allowed to continue the legal case simply because she is judged a pauper and they say, okay, we'll waive the fees. Um, I know that she had to have lived for 4.5 years because the legal case keeps going, but that's most of what I know about her. I know the circumstances surrounding the birth, death, and what I refer to as a cultural afterlife of the twins, but I know very little about Mary Herring herself, even though, as I said earlier, I think she is the biggest victim in all of this.
When we're talking about they were, in theory, making all of this money, but that would have been for at most 2 weeks. Even if people started showing up the day these girls were born. At
Yes,
most, we're talking about they were making that much money a day for 2 weeks tops. And you have to assume like there had to be time for word to get around, maybe for people to travel from other places. So this, as you said, it's a very short-lived windfall. I think you also mentioned they had debts, and so I would guess that
yes,
the moment their creditors heard that they had money, they showed up at the door as well. Um, so I can definitely see how that money would have disappeared fairly quickly. I'd also be curious who is saying that hundreds of people were showing up because I'm guessing that was their landlord trying to be like, well, they were already doing it. So I could see him having a reason to have that exaggerated. It also seems like that is an argument in favor of him stealing the girls because if the couple were already making money, why would they have outsourced that, so to speak? And I would also question how complicit Mary even was in this situation because not just you mentioned, she had already been ill, right? She has presumably some form of chronic illness that limits her
yes,
ability to intercede if she's not happy about this. But even if that weren't the case, she just delivered conjoined twins vaginally, like just happened. And
yes.
so this idea that she would have had much agency given what her physical condition must have been in those 2 weeks, it just doesn't seem that she would have been able to stop any of this if she wanted to. I mean, she could have been complicit. We don't know for sure because we don't know a lot, but um, it does very much seem like she, as you said, was the victim in this situation, as were her daughters.
Yes. I know that Mary and Richard got parish funds to help support them because they were impoverished. I also know that some of those funds came from their landlord, Henry Walrond, and so he almost certainly was one of their creditors, which doesn't really make its way into the legal documents other than that he claims to have tried to pay them a fair amount according to this agreement that he signed with Richard. Um, the fact that the twins are garnering so much money for the parents is indeed one of the reasons that I think they were probably actually kidnapped. The other side of that is that according to the agreement between Richard and Henry Walrond, the Herrings would receive full support for the remainder of the family for as long as the twins lived, and 1/8 of the profits for showing the twins all over England, which is what Walrond was going to undertake. And so, in theory, if the twins lived for a long time and Walrand was showing them all over the place, then this could, again, in theory, have been quite lucrative for the parents. In the short term, however, they would have been taking a massive financial hit by not having the twins in their own custody. The numbers of people visiting are mentioned by a bunch of different witnesses, people who are deposing on both sides of the legal case. So both for the Herrings and for Walrand. The numbers vary quite a bit, between about 300 and 700 a day. There's also the possibility that this is exaggeration. This is 2 years on, and the story, in theory, could have gotten bigger with every retelling. But certainly there were enough people constantly in the village, and this was a tiny village. It's less than 200 people today, and I think it was smaller than that at the time. Um, and there were enough people hanging out in the village waiting to see the twins that everyone was able to talk about how many people there were. The circumstances under which the twins were taken out of the Herring home are also kind of relevant here, because on the day that it occurred, when they were about 2 weeks old, there was still a crowd of people. There was still a line of people waiting to see the twins. Early in the morning, Walrand shows up, and this is one of the few times he talks to Mary, or at least that he reports that he talked to her. And he says he told her, "Your husband entered into an agreement with me. The children are mine." And this is one of the times that Aquila reports, essentially, Mary said, "No, under no circumstances, you can't have them." Walrand goes away. Richard is called out of the house to a nearby town. That is its own weirdness in the story. But a whole bunch of Walrand's cronies, people paid by him, show up at the house claiming to be protecting the twins from the throngs of people. But ultimately, according to people who are deposing on Mary's side of things, they say, look, this had been going on for 2 weeks. It wasn't a problem. The real problem was that these people showed up and started demanding sixpence of every person who entered before they'd be allowed into the building. Again, this is a cottage that has 2 rooms, plus a bit up in an attic space. This was not a large building. The bottleneck that was caused by Walrand's cronies showing up um, caused people in the line to be really disgruntled. Someone essentially tore open a window, and so the twins were being shown through the window, and people would throw their money in through the window to see the twins. And then Walrand uses all of this, I think, as an excuse to take the twins. And this is the moment when Aquila Taylor says, they were torn out of Mary's arms, and she says, "Do not tear my children asunder." They are removed from the house. They're taken to Walrand's local manor house, which is outside of the village of Isle Brewers, where this is all occurring. Um, he has them there for a few days where he's putting them on display, and a small mob shows up. How many people this was is really unclear. I suspect it was maybe a handful. He claims it's essentially torches and pitchforks, and they claim that they are going to tear down his house. And so he then, after a few days, moves the twins to the house of Sir Edward Phelps. This is the other one of those county gentry people who is depicted on the plates. And they stay in Phelps' house until they die at about a month old. And this is another part of the story where Mary actually, perhaps the part where she shows the most agency, but again, we only hear the story through other people. She goes to Montacute House, which is this house perhaps a dozen miles away, where the children have been moved. She goes there along with a few associates of a different gentry family in Somerset. This becomes a weird little political rivalry thing in the county. But she goes there with a few other people and says, hey, give me the twins. I have, in theory, it's a writ from the Court of King's Bench, which is another legal court in London. And that writ supposedly says, you have to give me back my daughters. Um, I'm saying supposedly because I haven't been able to find that actual document anywhere. But she shows up at Montacute House and says, I have this writ. It says you have to let me have the twins. She has to slip it under the door because they refuse to open it. One of the servants is yelling from an upstairs window saying, no, you're not going to be allowed in. At that point or the next day, she's told that one of the twins has died. And the following day, when she returns again, the second twin has died. And so we can imagine that Mary is hearing about this. It seems as though Richard was not present at Montacute House when she's being informed of these things. It seems that this is Mary hearing about the death of her children with pretty limited support.
I think it's pretty clear that the power disparity between the
Yes.
two parties in this case was already significant just when you said he's their landlord. Then you said also he is their creditor. Then you said, and he sent, I'm going to go ahead and call them thugs. Like it, you can say
Yes.
cronies. I'm
There.
going to go ahead and call them thugs to their house. And it's interesting because you mentioned that the thugs are the ones who start charging sixpence. And it honestly makes me wonder, did the family get any of that money? Because if they were not, if they weren't charging people beforehand, we don't actually know how much money they may have gotten. If the thugs are the ones creating a barrier and charging admission, why would we think that they actually gave the family any of that money, much less all of that money? So that I think really does clear up how she was still so poverty stricken after this happened. And especially if the whole, hundreds of people, sixpence, if that math really only applies to that one day before the dude, I agree, it sounds like he kidnapped the girls, even if there is a veneer of maybe Richard did agree to something, but with that power imbalance and the fact that this guy's already sent thugs to your house, and you've got other kids to worry about, and he's the local justice of the peace, in addition to being your landlord, I can definitely see how, even if on some level Richard did agree to this, that feels like it would have had to be incredibly coercive just by the nature of the situation.
Okay, so the agreement. There was an agreement. The agreement itself has not survived, as one of the court documents, Henry Walrond, repeats verbatim what he says was in the agreement. And I suspect that that is true because the Court of Chancery, as far as I can tell, had the agreement in their possession. So I think that the version that survives is an accurate version of what was agreed to. This was a signed contract between Henry and Richard. Um, because the original does not survive, I haven't been able to positively determine whether Richard signed it with his name versus made a mark, for example, an X. If he had signed it with his name, this is strong evidence that he was literate. If he signed it with a mark, that does not mean that he was illiterate. It just means that he might have been illiterate. One of the disagreements is whether or not Richard read the document before signing it or had it read to him before signing it. Richard says that he was called to Walren's house. The document already had been written up. They got him drunk and convinced him to sign it by claiming it was a different sort of document entirely. I think I've got I've got some circumstantial evidence on this one too. I think Richard was literate, but this is another one of those that I'm making an argument rather than actually able to prove a fact. I think that he was literate. I think that he was gotten drunk. I think that he did not read the document before signing it. Now, that said, we're right back to hugely coercive um, event. Obviously, Walrond has a different version of this. He says the entire thing was Richard's idea, which I just find implausible for a number of the reasons we've already talked about, including the one you mentioned, that they were earning a lot of money on their own. Why would they want to potentially earn less money, at least in the short term, by handing over the twins? So, power differential, absolutely. Further coercion, yeah, probably. Eventually, Walrond and various of his cronies asserted that they tried to pay Richard and Mary a number of different times, and that the Herrings refused the money. Eventually, 4 years on, so this is the extensive legal case that developed out of all of this, not quite at the end of it, because the court says it does not say that Walrond was guilty, but it says that he acted very inhumanely in this matter. It says Walrond does not just owe the Herrings, or in this case, Mary, because Richard has died by this point. Walrond does not just owe Mary an eighth of the profits, which is what the agreement said. Instead, he owes her 100% of the profits, and he is liable for court costs. It says the agreement has to be ripped up, and it says this is 3-ish years on. It says Walrond must return the embalmed bodies of the twins to Mary for burial in their home parish. So the twins, because Walrond had them in his custody, and also this was apparently a clause in the agreement that if the twins were to die, he could get them preserved. And he did. They were embalmed or some other similar preservation practice. We know that this preservation had been finished because by September of 1680, a few months after their deaths, he took them, the dead bodies, to London and put them on show there. Um, and years on, the judge in the case says you have to give the dead bodies back to the mother for burial. So the parish records, these are the baptism, marriage, and burial records for the parish of Isle Brewers. They don't survive from this period. This means that I can't tell you how many other children Richard and Mary Herring had. It means that I was having to kind of cobble together how everybody in this tiny village is related to one another. And so I cannot prove again that the twins were indeed returned to Mary for burial, but I suspect they were because that demand never shows back up in the materials, any of the remaining legal documents. Even though the court said, Walrond, you owe Mary Herring a lot of money, it was 238 pounds of money. This is what we have determined you owe to her. I don't think Mary ever got paid. Any of it, I suspect, let alone all of it. The the remainder of the legal documents are all little kind of administrative things. First, Walrond was dragging his feet on even showing up to talk to the clerks. Then he declared bankruptcy. This is the one that drives me nuts. The court agreed with him. He was allowed to do the same thing that Mary Herring was. She's living in this tiny cottage with children, and she is declared worth less than £5 sterling. Walrond has a manor house, and he is also declared in bankruptcy and then not liable for the legal costs, which goes right back to power differentials. Um, and he keeps dragging his feet, gets declared also a pauper, and uh, gets threatened to be thrown into Fleet Prison in London at one point because the court is getting so sick of him refusing to go along with any of their demands. But they do never mention burying the twins again, so I suspect that that at least happened. So Mary had, I think, some form of closure by the time all of this nasty, sordid affair dribbled to its end. But I cannot imagine that it didn't probably color the remainder of her life. She falls out of the documentary record at that point, kind of unsurprisingly, particularly since, again, the parish records just don't survive from Isle Brewers.
Not to mention whatever impact it had on the other three kids in this situation.
Right. Right. All I can tell you is that there were other children. I think there were three. That's the number that Aquila Taylor uses. And given that she was Richard's sister and she was spending a lot of time apparently in the house in the first 2 weeks of the twins' life, I'm pretty sure that she would have at least gotten those details correct.
So this is a particular interest of yours, shall we say, that, you've written this whole book about monstrosity, bodies, and knowledge in early modern England. I believe you mentioned this came out of your thesis work. So, what is it about this topic that intrigues you so?
So I'm really interested in bodies. I study history of medicine, among other things. I am particularly interested in when bodies go wrong in some way, shape, or form. I'm very interested in disability. I'm very interested in um, alterity and othering. These are themes that the interdisciplinary field of disability studies and the interdisciplinary field of monster studies have in common. There's a lot of us and them present in those fields. And I'm really interested in knowledge, what people knew, what they believed, how they found out about it, and more broadly, how they talked about it. What was known, what was believed, and why did it matter? This is the classic question that historians, the answer to your thesis question, you always have to answer the so what? Why does it matter? Why should we care? Why? Um, I think that everyone should care about this topic because it's a wild story, ultimately a very tragic one, but it's fascinating. I think that people should care about conjoined twins because they are a well documented variation on human physical expectations. They show up in the documentary record going back thousands of years. And every society comes up with different ways of explaining and ways of talking about and significances of individuals who don't conform to expected standard body shape. And so my interest in conjoined twins, I have this entire research arc. When people ask me, how are you studying conjoined twins? Why would you choose to study that? My research arc goes back to when I was 15. I was in a group that did uncut Shakespearean productions, kids theater troupe, aged 8 to 18. And these productions lasted like 6 hours. My parents sat through four of them. They love me very much. And I got very interested in Shakespeare. I get interested in the Shakespearean theaters. That got me fascinated with gender bending on the stage in late 16th and early 17th century England. All actors were men or boys if it was one of the children's companies. And so, of course, they were playing women's roles. And so you get a lot of gender bending on the stage. And then I got interested in gender bending in English society in the period. One of the individuals I studied for my master's thesis was a woman named Mary Frith, also known as Moll Cutpurse.
I actually have another episode on her.
She's amazing. She's another one of those who, yes, she existed. How much of what is recorded about her was true? Ooh, that's a difficult question. But she's fascinating. Strict minimum, she wore men's clothing some of the time. And when I was studying her, I came across a 19th century source, stories of the most notorious highwaymen and footpads and cutthroats in England. And it says about her that when she was alive, it was believed that she was a hermaphrodite. But then when she died, it was discovered that that was not so. And that reference made me wonder about what was referred to at the time as hermaphroditism. This is modern intersex in England in the period, and I studied that for my master's thesis. My question was, why were people so fascinated with hermaphroditism in the period in 17th century England? I came up with three answers to the question. One, unsurprisingly, sex sells. If it's a sexy topic, people will talk about it. And so publishers, printers were happy to publish all sorts of salacious stories. The second answer to my question was that sex and gender were synonymous in early modern England. Your genitals dictated your gender, which meant that they also dictated the clothing you wore, the sorts of jobs you could do, and more broadly, just your situation in society. And so when individuals had genitalia that did not neatly conform into masculine or feminine expectations, they caused problems, including legal problems. And so they needed to be neatly put into one of the two gender boxes and, in theory, stay there the remainder of your life. The third reason that people were fascinated with hermaphroditism in early modern England was that it was a form of monstrous birth. These were, again, the physically unusual humans and animals that I ended up studying for my dissertation. And people found those fascinating because they helped folks to understand the God's created cosmos and their place within it. And so this is how I came to study conjoined twins, and particularly the Herring family. Conjoined twins are a really useful metric by which to judge what is being written about these physically unusual humans and animals. Conjoined twins were very likely to have been written about. They are fairly easy to track through multiple publications over the course of decades or centuries, because they often had bits of identifiable information associated with them, such as birth date and place and a physical description. And it became one of the central topics, ultimately, of my book because of this representation, particularly within the printed sources of the period.
Join us next time on the Infinite Women podcast, and remember, well-behaved women rarely make history.